What's going on, YouTube? Today we're talking worm bins. Hi, my name is David and welcome to Reconciliation Homestead, where we hope to encourage, inspire, and educate you to live a more sustainable life. So the number one concern most people have about worm bins is that they're gonna stink. The second concern that people have is that there's gonna be bugs. And so today we're gonna talk about a few ways that you can prevent this from happening, and we're gonna go a little bit deeper into the worm bin design that I've been using for the last 5 years. So without further ado, here she is. Classic 5-gallon bucket worm bin design. What we have here is 4 5-gallon buckets from Home Depot. These are 5 years old and they're still going strong. You have one lid, preferably a lid that has a rubber O-ring and can snap on there really securely. What you're going to need to do is they already are going to stack very nicely. I prefer to remove the handles from all but the bottom bucket so that it's easier to unstack them and move them around. When you're building this, it's pretty easy. You just need a drill and 2 drill bits. You use 1/8-inch holes for the air holes, and you use 1/4-inch holes for the worm holes. And we'll get into a little bit later why both of those are really important. But before we get too deep into this design specifically, I want to talk about the mentality of having a worm bin. The most important thing you need to know about keeping a worm bin is that this is not a recipe. You got to get that idea out of your head. A worm bin is an ecosystem. You're managing an ecosystem. And so what you can do when you're managing an ecosystem is you can suggest things to go in a certain direction, but really it's the players, it's the worms, it's the ecosystem, it's nature that runs the bin. There's a certain practitioner that I like to listen to who talks about managing an ecosystem like the conductor of an orchestra. We can tell the players when they need to come in, we can help everybody keep in time, but we're not the ones playing the instruments, and so we're not the ones ultimately responsible for the sound or what the end product is. So, with that in mind, let's talk about ecosystem needs. Air, water, shelter, food, the same things that you need, your worm bin needs. You need to think about the whole picture. So, pretty straightforward. Let's start with the shelter. We've got our buckets, okay? The design of this is layered. Each of these buckets are not attached, so they all come apart. But this is ultimately what you're housing your worms in. So this structure needs to have some design elements thought into it. The first one we're going to talk about is air. So the worms need to breathe. They need oxygen. What makes that stinky smell is going anaerobic. It's a lack of oxygen. It's fermenting. It's what makes beer and wine and alcohol taste good. Doesn't work for your worm bins. They need an oxygen-rich environment. So for each bin, you'll see a close-up here. We've got some air holes drilled around the rim of the bucket, and it's all the way down. Each bucket has these air holes drilled into it. And then we also have some air holes in the top, drilled however you want. It doesn't really matter. It's just to let air in, but you don't want to drill them too big. So the 1/8 of an inch I've found is perfect because it doesn't let too many of the worms out if they want to escape. and it doesn't let very much in except for small bugs. The second holes you're going to be drilling in there, which also help with the air, but they're really for letting the worms move around, is in the bottom. So you can see that there. The bottom of the bin has 1/4 of an inch holes drilled into it. And that's just really so the worms can move up and down. And if you notice the difference between the holes here, there's not nearly as many as there are in the bottom. Basically as many as will fit into the bottom of the bucket. That's what you're going to put in there. Okay, so we've talked about air. Your worms do not like sun, so don't let them be exposed to sun or heat. They kind of like it in the same temperatures that you like. 72, around 50% humidity. That's what people like. That's what your compost worms are going to like. Speaking of humidity, let's talk water. Your worm bins, if they get too wet, is what makes them go anaerobic and they get stinky. So the best way that I've come to describe that is you want them to be damp but not dripping. Meaning if you take the material that's in your worm bin and you squeeze it, you should be able to get maybe 1 or 2 drops out. If you're squeezing it with all your might, you might get 1 or 2 drops out. But you don't want it to be so dry that you don't feel any moisture at all. There's that happy medium. It's about balance. It's not about a recipe. We'll get to bugs because, like I said, you're managing an ecosystem. So there's going to be more than just worms living in your worm bins. You'll get all sorts of little creepy crawlies and things that you don't know what they are. What's most common in my worm bins right now is springtails, which is what people buy springtails to put them in terrariums because they help maintain a balance in the ecosystem of a terrarium. They also are going to help you out in your worm bins, so there's nothing to worry about here. You do want to be concerned if you start seeing things like fly maggots. It means you either probably drilled too big of holes in there, or you've fed way too much food and you've attracted some flies. Some like house flies, not like fruit flies or fungus gnats. I will say fungus gnats is the thing that I struggle most with in my worm bins, and it's usually because I know that I have overfed them. So this might be getting a little bit deeper in there, but we're going to talk about how you keep the bugs out of your worm bins specific to this design. For food, you want a mix of carbon and nitrogen, browns and greens. You got to think about your worm bin as like a compost pile. This is where this is where people get themselves tripped up and they start thinking worm bins are a recipe. If I just mix the right ingredients, I'm going to have success. Well, as an ecosystem, yes, you need to have the right players on the stage. You need to make sure you have all of the instruments, but you are just coaxing them into the right direction. You ultimately aren't going to be guaranteed success. You got to be aware of what's happening. So in the early stages, you want to have a lot more brown material and a lot less green material. My preferred choice for brown material or carbon is brown grocery bags, and I bought a cheap paper shredder on Amazon, which I will link to in the description, which does cross cut. So you see how I can drop these little pieces of brown paper, and they're not long strips that get all tangled together. They're very broken apart, which means the worms can more easily move between the layers. They can get into the browns and the greens and move around, but you're not going to get a lot of the clumping issues that you would get with just the long string paper shredder. So it's a little more expensive to get the crosscut, but totally worth it. And this paper shredder I have abused for the last 5 years, and it's still going strong. I've only oiled it a couple times just to keep things moving. So what you're mixing is browns and greens. So why people like worm bins Typically, it's because they have food scraps that they want to get rid of, or you're trying to get some fertilizer for your houseplants or for your garden. So how you get that beautiful vermicompost is by a balance, managing the balance of these browns and these greens. That's a bit of a lengthy conversation to get into now. So for the sake of this video, we're going to talk about browns as these shredded brown paper bags. You can use ripped up egg cartons or soaked ripped up shredded cardboard, non-waxy cardboard preferably. It doesn't have any print on it if possible. And for the greens, we're going to talk about maybe you have some lettuce clippings or things like that, small amounts of that. But what I suggest people starting out do is coffee grounds or tea leaves. And that's because they get hot water poured over them. They're spent grounds, and a lot of that sterilization process prevents you bringing in some pests or some diseases to your worm bins. Just when you're starting out, it's really helpful, and it's harder for that to go more towards the anaerobic and attracting lots of bugs and things like that. So what I suggest people do is drop in, you can see here, I've got a coffee filter from a couple weeks ago. Had grounds in it at one point. There's still some grounds in there, but mostly the worms have eaten all this out, and you can see all kinds of little worm activity going on in there. See if I can't get a close-up. So here's what the inside of that coffee filter looks like. Come on, dang it. There we go. So you can see all the little springtails crawling all over that. And there's a bunch of little baby worms, if you can zoom in on your screen there and see those. But that's what I'm feeding to get my bin started. And it's super easy. Before I get too far into the conversation around managing the worms, I want to talk about the rest of this bucket design. We talked about the air holes. We talked about the worm holes. There's one key factor, is that one bucket doesn't have any wormholes, and that is the bottom bucket. No holes. This is the base, the foundation, the worm home. It's called all sorts of things. In this bin, when you're setting it up, you're never putting any food in there. You may put a little bit of water, but this bin you're just filling with the kind of home base for your worms. This is where they're going to retreat when they're not eating. Lots of people like to put peat moss or coconut coir in there. That's, again, just damp enough for you to squeeze some drops out of, but not too wet. I personally don't use either of those because I like to get rid of my shredded paper. So I will shred up my paper bags and I will fill the whole bottom up pretty securely with damp, shredded brown paper bag. The next layer, when you're starting out, you may only have the one layer. You're only feeding on the one layer. That bottom layer, first bucket, will have wormholes drilled in the bottom of it, and it'll have those air holes on the side, and you're going to fill that up so it's pretty full with shredded brown paper or whatever your carbon material is. And you want to be able to set the bucket inside all the way down. The other buckets should be sitting all the way down. That way, you're not smashing it down too far. It's not that full, but you want to be able to feel the tension, so it's pretty compact in there, just so that the worms have some mixtures with their greens. Then what I would do is take some of my coffee filters, my coffee grounds, and I would put one of those in there, and I would wait until I've checked it every week until it's almost gone, depending on how many worms you have. When you see that they have consumed all of that one, add another one, and slowly your population will build up to the point where you may be able to put some in there daily. That might be a little bit too much for some indoor situations, but it is possible. Your worms can eat their body weight every day. So if you have a pound of worms in your bin, they can eat a pound of food scraps a day. I suggest people start as small as possible so that you don't go too deep and get out of balance and get smell and get bugs. You want to build the ecosystem slowly. So after you've got your shredded cardboard, what I said, feed as little as possible. Only give the worms as little water as possible, because if you overwater, you're going to get smell. And if you overfeed, you're going to get smell and bugs. So in order to prevent smell and bugs, manage your water and manage your food. In this bin, the last part that I really love, and this is the one reason, as I said earlier in the beginning of this video, this is the reason why I use this method, and I think it helps with the smell and the bugs more than any other method, is because this top bucket here, this top bucket doesn't have any food in it, doesn't have any of the nitrogen in it. This is my carbon storage. This is where I keep all of my shredded paper. And this acts to absorb any of the smell that's coming up through the bin, has to get filtered through this carbon. And so it kind of absorbs some of that smell. And when the bugs are trying to get in, they have to go in through all of this carbon as well. And it kind of prevents a lot of those issues just by having this here. Also, an additional benefit to having this top part filled with the shredded paper is that worms in a starvation situation, if you don't feed them enough, can live on this material. They will consume this material. And as you may saw in my last video, when I forgot about my worms for a whole year, the reason that they didn't die is because I had these top buckets filled with shredded paper. So the worms were barely getting by on that. Now, it's not ideal, and obviously I would never do that again if I had a choice, but I forgot about them and life happened. And I'm assuming that life is going to happen to you too, and you're going to forget about your worm bins. So this is a way to help you with your mistakes, help you keep from making a fatal mistake and ruining your whole worm bin. And so finally, my last tip for managing your worm bins in a way that you get high quality compost, you're managing your food scraps, and you're not getting bugs and smell, is to put a Post-it note right on top. You can see mine right there. That I just take notes of things like, when was the last time I fed them? How much activity did I see? Did I see baby worms? How much food did I feed them? You know, how did it smell? Things like that, so I know I can come back and go, okay, this worm bin, this is the situation, and I can help to manage the ecosystem, continue to push it in the right direction, and maybe correct some problems that I saw. For example, in this bin, it got a little smelly in the bottom because I let the food decompose, and slowly that'll fill up your bottom bucket with water, and I didn't check the bucket for a long time, so it got very fermenty, it got very stinky. And so what I did is I pulled all of that material out. I tried to get as many worms out as possible, and I just refilled the bottom of the bucket up with shredded paper. Just a hard restart. The worms were living in the top compartments because the bottom was uninhabitable. They couldn't live there. They didn't like it. Just to close, thanks again for your time. Thanks for watching this video. I hope this is helpful to you who are starting out. And that if you have more questions, I'd love to do some follow-up videos answering people's questions about the worm bins. I was trying to be as basic and as quick as possible for this video specifically. So let me know in the comments if there's anything else that you want me to cover or any other questions that I can follow up with. Have a great day, guys. I'll see you on the next one. Peace.